All right, great. Well, welcome, folks. My name is Robert Sears. I am from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and I am the government principal for the ACT-IAC Network and Telecommunications Community of Interest. And for those who are new, ACT-IAC is the American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Council, and our NNT, or we call the, let me go to the next slide, please. Our Network and Telecommunications Community of Interest. This is our group that is focusing on what it says here, network and telecommunications. And we're really focused on bringing together government and industry to collaborate, talk about challenges with government networking, new technologies, things around contracts like EIS and past contracts like network services, strategies on wireless, on just all the areas that will better the government when we look at communications, data networks. This Network and Telecommunications Community of Interest, in the past, we've done topics on SD-WAN and cybersecurity and other areas. So we're really focused again on the network and telecommunications portion here. This is our leadership. These folks are the combination of government and industry. So I'm the government chair, as I said. Richard Zelkowitz is our industry chair. He is actually no longer with Granite. We need to change that. He has retired, but he's still helping us out. We have Erica Jacobs from the state, Stephen Mathern from AT&T, Ginger Murray from Ginger Murray Associates, Lee Mosher from Fortinet, and Ginger Crawford from GDIT. So they're part of our leadership team here that helps put together all these great events that we hope you are enjoying today. Next slide, please. So one of the few things before we get going with our keynote, our key speaker here is we do have projects that we do within the community of interest that focus on delivering to the government community and industry some key areas of focus. So we have two major projects this year. One is the operational use of non-terrestrial networks. I'm going to come back to that one because I'm going to tie it into with our speaker, and the retirement of legacy copper circuits. That's a big issue, of course, with federal government. There's a lot of federal government folks that are still on TDM-based infrastructure. So that project is really looking at examining impact, providing suggestions on how to better that migration as providers retire the copper infrastructure. Going back to the other one, we're examining the use of non-terrestrial networks, so technology like 4G, 5G, LEOs, microwaves, where the government might choose to solely exist on those for their telecommunications needs. So we have various federal partners that have done deployments, either tested or fully operating on these. And we want to highlight those projects and share them with the community. So it give you a little bit of like a 101 or a primer on usage of these types of technologies. So please, look forward to these deliverables coming out. We'll have probably some monthly highlights and sessions on these as well. So just stay tuned for these projects to come. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, and tying that into our one project there on federal use of non-terrestrial networks is spectrum. So when we look at the networking, wireless communications, be it from a satellite like a low Earth orbiting satellite to 4G, 5G, it all needs spectrum, right? It needs that radio frequency spectrum that's Mr. Scott Patrick, who's joining us today, who's the Executive Director of NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management. So it's great to have him here. A quick bio, Scott Patrick helps direct NTIA's work on national spectrum strategies and policies. His responsibilities include overseeing development of spectrum sharing and repurposing strategies in his agency, working to address the needs of the federal and commercial spectrum usage. Before joining NTIA, or the National Telecommunications Information Administration, Mr. Patrick was a wireless media and technology attorney in private practice, counseling telecom, cable, broadcast, and broadband companies on a wide range of policies, transactional and regulatory matters. He also served as an attorney in the Wireless Telecommunication Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. And early in his career, Mr. Patrick was a research engineer at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, where he helped develop fiber optic electromagnetic sensors. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law and holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. So great background there in Spectrum. So we could talk and walk the walk. So welcome, Patrick. I think we're going to be turning over to you to bring up your slides and your presentation. And yeah, really look forward to hearing about spectrum management and what that brings not only to the government, but to industry and our partners.
Well, thank you very much. First, just make sure everybody can hear me okay. Sound check. We're good. Okay.
Gotcha.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here today, this afternoon. And right up front, before I forget, important disclaimer. So even though I'm an employee of the federal government, what I say today, I'll be speaking my personal views and not to reflect positions, formal or otherwise, of the federal government. My understanding is we've got a kind of a wide variety of expertise in the audience. So I'm going to try to pitch down the middle, and hopefully that will mean that only half of you will be asleep at a time. So that will hopefully that will work. And if all of you fall asleep at once, we'll get there. All right. And I'm mostly going to be talking about what's called the National Spectrum Strategy. And this was something that the White House issued in November. And it was kind of the skeleton. And subsequently, NTIA and the other federal agencies provided what's called the implementation plan for that strategy, or the I plan, and that's kind of the meat to the skeleton. So that'll be the main topic, and let me start by trying to share. I was telling him I had a new laptop issued to me, which might sound like a good thing, but it does mean that things are not where they used to be. So everybody seeing that okay? Seeing the first slide?
Yes.
That's great.
Okay, great. All right, well then I think we're good to go. All right, so like I said, National Spectrum Strategy, you may be familiar with it, maybe not. It is a big deal. And I'm going to, the first part of this, just to kind of provide some background and context, is like, where did this come from? Why did it happen? And let's see, go to here, and there we go. All right, so what I'll be talking about today, just the why this came about and the development of the strategy itself, the issuance of the strategy in November. The strategy has 4 pillars or elements. The pillar is the lingo, so we'll be getting into those 4 pillars. As I mentioned, talk about the implementation plan and what that means for federal agencies in the beginning, and what ultimately it might mean for everyone. And then a little bit of what comes next after, what should be expected after these the strategy is implemented, probably talking a timeline here for federal government's piece, or at least the executive branch's piece, looking towards the end of 2026 to so it's kind of, I won't go any further than that in this talk. All right, so oh, and by the way, yeah, if you have questions, I can't really see questions from my screen, I don't believe, but I think Mr. Steer said he would be collecting them, and there'll be some time at the end for questions. So I hope that process is okay.
Yep, we gotcha.
So Spectrum, I know this crowd already knows what that's about, and there are several elements that kind of merge together to suggest that something more formal, something with a longer view, was needed in the spectrum space. And so a few of those things you can see on this slide. So first of all, and this is really a necessary piece, right? I mean, we're all using more and more spectrum for a variety of things. And this is a success story. And you can always tell good success stories because we quickly just take it for granted. And so maybe kind of one of my soapbox issues, I just try to remind people that's good that we take it for granted. Let's pause for a moment and not take it for granted, and then we can take it for granted again after I finish speaking. But it's a good story. The spectrum dependent systems, most of course, is driven by our devices and the apps which do more and more every day. But it's not just that. I mean, there's, and we'll talk about this a little bit, the federal government also uses a lot of spectrum, and not just for kind of what you might call telecommunications. The federal government, especially Mr. Sears at NOAA, they use spectrum to sense often by satellite with the sensors that are passive. Many of them are passive sensors, which means they have to be protected even more than telecommunications from harmful interference. So there's a lot of things, a lot of spectrum dependent systems out there. And so we were on this path of, like, every few years, the commercial sector said we need more spectrum. We need more spectrum. And in the beginning, that was the easy way to do it. There was kind of fallow greenfield spectrum out there that folks could identify and maybe not stress too much to try to what we would call repurpose, or take that spectrum and shift it over from possibly federal use or some other low intensity use, and shift it to, say, here you go, to the FCC, and FCC would be in charge of auctioning the spectrum off, which pretty quickly made us all very popular with Congress, which oddly enough seems to enjoy getting additional revenues, especially when it's seemingly costless to them. So we're happy to kind of do our part on that. And but then another issue in the third bullet there, increasing difficulty with coordination. And that's just kind of what I was getting at about, in the beginning, repurposing spectrum was not too difficult. But as you might expect, the low-hanging fruit, or whatever phrase you want to use, gets taken, and then you start getting these where people are bumping up against each other. And these, to the extent you're familiar with these, one big issue was 24 gigahertz, which NOAA was a piece of, and that is ongoing, although hopefully about to maybe wrapping up this year, where you had spectrum that was adjacent to spectrum that NOAA was using or is using for passive sensors, and that spectrum also got auctioned off, and concerns were perhaps not, maybe dismissed isn't the right word, but not supported, or didn't have time to support concerns in these kind of policy making. So 5.9 is adjacent to a big piece of spectrum that was given to Wi-Fi. That's Wi-Fi that's, or even more generally, I should say, unlicensed spectrum, where, much like a public park, you don't need a license to come in and use it. So, the FCC and has promoted the use of unlicensed spectrum, and there's a lot of innovation in that space as well. But have to recognize, much like a public park, there's not a kind of, it's more of a citizens level, not a natural advocate for those things. So issues can arise there. And then there was last couple of years, actually starting more in 2020 or even 2019, the altimeter issue. Some of the people on this here today might be familiar with that one, where, again, spectrum was auctioned, concerns were raised. Perhaps there wasn't enough time to demonstrate those concerns in a kind of evidence-based, sound way. And so things can happen quickly, and then you have to come back in and clean things up. So these are the kinds of things that were happening, and Congress didn't like the look, and nobody likes the look. These are things that ostensibly should have been resolved earlier rather than post auction or post repurposing. So you had when a new Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, came in, she said in her testimony, called for establishing a spectrum strategy. And very early on, one of the big pieces was kind of helping create a structure that would help coordination more between the FCC and NTIA. Kind of real quick, many of you may know, so our country's pretty unusual as far as the world goes. In most of the world, most of the countries have one government entity that manages spectrum. The United States, kind of consistent with our division of government and checks and balances. You have NTIA, where I work, is a part of the executive branch, so we manage federal spectrum. The FCC is a creature of Congress and independent, and it governs and regulates the private sector or spectrum that has been allocated to the private sector. So there were efforts made to try to improve that coordination early on. The so-called MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, was updated, and some of the features just there real quick. So increasing the frequency of meetings, kind of insisting on having longer lead time to preview initiatives. That was a big deal in those issues that I mentioned earlier. And then just a commitment on the part of leadership to make sure that material or meaningful communications are exchanged. So that was a nice first step, but it was a deliberate first step, and then we moved on to kind of creating this strategy. And the team for putting that strategy together, the White House was in charge, if you will, and they had members from their Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Security Council and Economic Council. NTIA, which sits inside the Department of Commerce, we were involved, including ITS, which is the research arm of NTIA, housed in Colorado. Other federal agencies, you have, just to kind of give you a snapshot, the big user of spectrum in the executive branch is the Defense Department. And as you might expect, they have important missions, statutory missions, and missions that require spectrum and spectrum-dependent systems to get those done. And of course, the Federal Communications Commission, which is regulating the commercial side, which has this interest that seemingly never ends of saying, hey, the commercial parties want more spectrum. So these parties get together and we develop goals to try to facilitate and identify and modernize policies. And you'll see here that the White House has, of course, many stakeholders that it has to be mindful of, and that's a good thing. So one of the big pieces you'll see in the strategy was, hey, we lead the world in technology, we lead the world in spectrum use. We can't take that for granted. Let's make sure we create policies, put them in place that promote efficiency, so that we're using our spectrum wisely. The phrase you'll see, that third bullet, or there's a phrase there, ensure spectrum access. That's kind of the phrase you'll hear, meaning spectrum access, meaning let me use spectrum. I want to have access to that spectrum to use it. And you can see there whether, I'm sorry to go back, of users of spectrum in the federal government. Behind DoD, there's DOT, Department of Transportation, and FAA, and they use a lot of spectrum as a big part of making sure that the airlines, whether it's in the air, on the ground, or wherever, and increasingly more than just airplanes, but drones and so forth, making sure that those are done safely. And of course, public safety, we have, while most of the, or much of the police and fire are state issues, there's plenty of Department of Justice use of spectrum for public safety. Okay, sorry for that aside, go back. So then in November, the White House, adhering to these goals, issued its the spectrum strategy. It created a new group, Interagency Spectrum Advisory Council, that would be filled at the highest levels of each department, and would have an important thing, have some kind of decisional authority rather than having to send things back and have them run through the department and wait another however many days or weeks for a decision to be made. The strategy also called for the implementation plan, which you'll see came out just in March. And then another important piece spelled out the roles of NTIA and federal agencies. As you might see or suspect, or maybe you're already involved in, federal agencies need spectrum too. And this notion of kind of like this zero-sum game of taking spectrum from a federal agency and giving it to commercial operators, federal agencies aren't so enamored of that. So they're looking for ways to say, hey, we have statutory missions as well. We need spectrum as well. So let's do this right. So part of this spectrum strategy, or the NSS, National Spectrum Strategy, had a public piece, and there was a lot of public outreach. There were public listening sessions, also some tribal listening sessions, and then the interagency, as is the executive branch, FCC, going listening to the points they had and want to make. And then, like I said, the FCC also helped in preparing and commenting. And then there was issue resolution where there were conflicts. The White House was calling balls and strikes, but they wanted to be, they wanted to call it right. So there was a good deal of getting up to speed on some issues where conflicts existed. So the strategy was issued in November. It's a consensus document, meaning that, hey, not everybody got everything they wanted, but the compromises reflected in it, hopefully, are a matter of balancing, and so balancing issues and equities. So the 4 pillars that emerged, and this is kind of, we'll get into this in a moment so you can see what it really means, if that's the phrase. But these are aspirational pillars, and so it has the language that reflect that. So pillar 1, spectrum pipeline to ensure U.S. leadership in advanced and emerging technologies. This idea of a pipeline we'll get into, but the idea is, as you probably figured out, these things take a long time. I have a brother-in-law who was an almond farmer for a while in his life, and from the moment you plant that seed, it takes, I think, 7 years to get an almond out of it. So that's kind of a similar time frame on some of these repurposing efforts or decisions not to repurpose if the science doesn't back it. So the pipeline kind of reflects that, hey, it's going to take a while to get from soup to nuts on those things. Pillar 2, collaborative long-term planning to support spectrum needs. That's just getting the idea that, hey, it's better to be able to plan these things out rather than reflexively responding to crises. And so structures are set up to help make that happen. Number 3, spectrum innovation. Like I said before, the White House has a strong goal, and we all do have a strong aspiration to ensure that the United States maintains its global leadership role. And number 4, expanding spectrum expertise. That kind of fits into 3, and we'll talk a little bit about that, of trying to make sure we have enough people power in the future to and subject matter expertise to help maintain these other three pillars. And then, like I say, they're inside these pillars, they have strategic objectives, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. And then the implementation plan, the meat to the bone, that was released in March. It has, I hate to mix metaphors here. While it does have a lot of meat on the bone, there are also a lot of weeds in the implementation plan. And if I want to make sure I get all of you to fall asleep on a Friday afternoon, I would dig into those weeds a lot. So I'll try to rev this up and keep out of the weeds, but feel free to ask about them in the Q&A part if you want. But you get the gist, right? That the we are putting the meat to the bone. We are doing things, and you'll see things are already moving to try to get the strategy implemented. So what does the implementation plan? Like I said, it identifies some very specific issues. It identifies specific federal agencies that are responsible for particular outcomes. And it identifies the stakeholders, both inside and outside the government, and we have a timeline for trying to specific actions that we've identified, and then saying, hey, this is when that gets finished, and so forth. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit of this, and pardon me for just a sec. All right, so some substance now to the strategy. So pillar one says, hey, spectrum pipelines. And one of the first things, and maybe the most contentious thing, was identifying particular pieces of spectrum bands that we wanted to examine to say, hey, might we be able to repurpose this spectrum? And the 5 bands you'll see there's lower 3000, I'm sorry, I use megahertz here. You'll see megahertz and gigahertz kind of interchange, but the lower 3 gigahertz, or the 3100 to 3450 megahertz, that band has already been looked at a good deal, and so we'll talk about that some more. There's a smaller piece in the 5 gigahertz or 50-30 megahertz band. The 7-8 gigahertz band is a big piece of spectrum, and we'll be looking at that. That's already underway. The 18.1 to 18.6 gigahertz, I don't know if anyone is online from NASA, but that's although a smaller piece, it's one that will be hopefully very helpful to NASA to try to take advantage of, if this can be repurposed to the commercial sector. NASA very much would there are things that they like to outsource to the commercial sector if they have the adequate tools to do so. So hopefully that'll be a nice win-win. And then the 37 gigahertz is also underway. The 37 gigahertz, you may notice, that's a pretty high band, and so it has a little different demand characteristics than most of those other bands. So let me just talk a little bit here then about these bands and the idea, what's behind them. So the idea, when you're looking for spectrum that you might repurpose, the strategy commits to evidence-based support and data-based. So doing it as kind of close to it a scientific method as possible to say, hey, this will, is this possible? So an ideal piece of spectrum that like I mentioned, that if you're looking to repurpose, would be just a fallow, not being used. Like, oh, look, here's 100 megahertz. Nobody's using it anywhere in the country. Let's just repurpose that. So that's kind of the extreme. And in between, as you move down, there are bands that might only be used episodically or might be used in just limited geographic areas. Those bands would be attractive, but you got to figure that out, and that's what we're that's what we're doing. Say, hey, what can be repurposed? And as I mentioned, the low hanging fruit is gone. So a big piece of this is saying, while so-called exclusive use, meaning that if you were to repurpose this to a commercial side, if the commercial operator would have exclusive use of it over the country, meaning in all locations and at all times, that is increasingly difficult, although, like I say, preferred. So the kind of the big tool that we're looking to use is some version of so-called spectrum sharing, or as other folks might say, coexistence, so that harmful interference isn't being created. This coexistence, we're looking, and this is where more and more of the innovation we're hoping to unleash and rely upon, and already underway. But that kind of coexistence structure, whether you're and they call, another phrase you'll hear is dynamic spectrum sharing, where even maybe it can be shared at one time where one party's using it, and at another time another party you might be using it, and have some kind of mechanism that would figure that out efficiently and reliably and robustly. A lot on this slide, just showing you of those 5 bands, kind of the structure of the studies that goes on, and so maybe the 7 to 8 gigahertz piece is one just to focus on. So there are federal agency stakeholders, what you might call as incumbents, operators in the band. You'll have the public side, commercial stakeholders who would be interested in ultimately bidding on and perhaps winning a license at auction. You have academia, which is trying to explain the rules of the road and saying, oh no, that you're going to get interference in that condition, you're going to not. You'll have technologists who might say you can't do that or you can do that. So a lot of stakeholders, and this chart, that's what this chart basically reflects. And we're trying to create a formal mechanism and allow sufficient time for that exchange of communication to be embedded in a policy, and ultimately some kind of policy. Let's move to pillar 2, and you can kind of see there is some overlap here, but pillar 2 is the idea is to the big strategic objective of that is to create a planning process that's guided by the best available science and data. So folks are working on this and providing ideas on this. I'll just say that I mean, you know, I think ideally, right, you would have had some of these things done before the band studies start, and indeed we are borrowing from pillar 2 tremendously to start implementing some of these pillar 1 objectives. I would just say that these improvements are in the frameworks and the communication are already happening and already in place. So this reflects, if you go down to like that strategic objective 2.3, and you'll see there where I was talking a little bit about spectrum sharing. One of the big pieces is trying to involve get these new capabilities needed for data and IT and modeling, even, you know, as you might expect nowadays, trying to incorporate AI if possible, modestly, but and also to establish best practice for identifying whether interference exists, whether it's harmful, material, and of course, you know, in many ways, as innovation goes on, this can be a moving target as we get better at and are able to extract more and more out of less and less spectrum. So those are the pieces for Pillar 2. But again, the idea is that Pillar 2 would be supporting Pillar 1. Just as well, not an aside, but just want to mention, and perhaps you all have some involvement in this. One piece of Pillar 2 is to emphasize the importance of and the use of something called the CSMAC, which is the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, which I think there are the applications for they're starting a new cycle right now. The application period is closed. Some of you in the audience may be applying to be on CSMAC, but it's a great board, huge amount of expertise and brain power. So we'll be looking to reconstitute that and get the benefit and the advice of these experts that can help drive policy. Okay, well, let's move on now to Pillar 3. And Pillar 3 calls for more enhanced coordination of research and development. And my very first job out was in a research lab, so I know how that works. There always this, and some of you may be as well, right? Always kind of a tension between so many good results come organically, but then you want to make sure you're getting the right results. So you want to set the table properly to get those results. So not an easy thread to get through that eye of the needle, but we've identified the goals. The goal is spur innovation and leadership in spectrum management and spectrum use. A big piece of this one is receiver operation. Traditionally, the focus in regulations and rules and statutes has been on the transmitter side. And that's because, traditionally, or maybe, or especially in the commercial space, there are only a few transmitters and lots of receivers. So the idea was to try to keep those receiver costs down for the public. But as we try to get more and more use out of less and less spectrum, lots of times the easy solution is to make these receivers more robust to what otherwise would be harmful interference. And of course that does mean, right, when you're hard shelling receivers or increasing the efforts to hard shell them, then that's going to increase the cost of the device. But it also takes time to do these things. So some decisions have to be looked at, and looking for a roadmap then to help get to that point where we can build more robust receivers. And you can see there in some of the other pieces of in Pillar 3, something that we're involved with, and our research arm ITS is involved with, is to developing a plan for research and development. And a lot of that is focused on the spectrum sharing that I mentioned earlier, as well as in IT, the data collection. And there's also this spectrum sandbox, which is trying to make a place where folks don't need a license to try out ideas, to have a place where people can come and without going through 2, 3 months of red tape to say, hey, I want to try out this idea. Let's see if it works. And so we're trying to create this sandbox program that would help promote that. And then another specific piece is referred to as the dynamic spectrum sharing, and that is and then creating a national testbed for dynamic spectrum sharing. I was about to mention some more about the receivers, but I've probably already bored you enough with on that. But the receivers can be an important piece, and it's hard. I'm excited about what direction that goes, and I'm looking forward to how that turns out. That could be a big piece, and of course, so this is the last bullet on here. A big piece in all of this is money. Spectrum is expensive, or at least based on the auctions that you can see that the FCC does. Spectrum is expensive, so it justifies in some ways trying to get funds to free up spectrum and using those funds wisely, and trying to find the right place to spend those funds to say, hey, we want to be able to well, like I say, like the third bullet says, pursue policies that maximize flexible spectrum use and innovative technologies. Okay, let's move to pillar 4. And this is the workforce development. This is one I'm not as involved in, and I know there's a lot going on. And again, some of you may be involved in some of this, but because I know a lot is already happening at the university level of efforts to attract you know, I think marketers use the phrase mind share. You try to get some of that mind share in college students and help make spectrum something that they may be attracted to for a career. Another piece of it is trying to get policymakers up to speed on spectrum. You know, that's can be tough. I find the policymakers are a pretty sharp bunch, but like all of us, they're stretched in different ways, and sometimes they are forced to make decisions and not being up to speed completely on a particular issue, and recognizing that, trying to get people comfortable in spectrum rather than just saying, oh, you know, that's too scary. I'll just defer to someone else. So, and then that last bullet, building a public understanding of importance, that kind of gets back to how I started saying, you know, it's not quite the right say metaphor. I used to hear the phrase like, well, it's like winning a pie eating contest, and the prize is more pie. And so we're trying to emphasize that, hey, there are a lot of things out there that you're taking for granted. You shouldn't take it for granted. And let's make sure we build everyone's understanding so that they can keep taking it for granted. So that's a tough thread as well, but I think people are Americans are pretty excited about innovation and understanding what drives it and what's getting us there. Okay, I bought, you know, this slide I mostly just put there for my own, just to remind me and to kind of explain where we're going from here. So all those numbers on there refer to parts of the implementation plan, but suffice it to say, from here, you say, well, you know, we put all these pillars together, and I think you've got a pretty good path for keeping the nation at the forefront of spectrum innovation, telecommunications innovation, and the global leader. And I think with that, I am done. And what I will do is stop sharing and get back to the screen here. And I guess I can open the floor for questions. And happy to answer what I can.
Definitely. Let's see. I do have a few off to the side, but if there's anybody in the meeting space, I believe you can unmute your microphone. So if you want to ask Scott a question directly, and again, I captured a few off to the side as well. So if there's no takers, I'll jump into the ones that I have written down here. So this one's actually from myself. I was just curious. Since NTIA is also managing the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity and Delivery Program, is there any tie-ins there with development of new technology? I know a lot of it's more grant money, or not grant money, but money going into the state for building. But where is there a tie-in there, and as far as spectrum goes, and um, maybe trying to look at farther reach in rural communities and coverage, if you could speak about that.
Sure. There are tie-ins are kind of more implicit. Um, the so our office of Spectrum Management inside NTIA, traditionally is the largest office. It's been the biggest job that that NTIA does traditionally, and in fact, our office is in the past has been larger than all the other offices combined. So that under the Biden administration, that has not been the case. The BEAD program and other similar efforts made to expand connectivity to areas that are either not served or underserved. That is more of a wireline effort, although there are definitely pieces of it involved with spectrum. But any rate, yeah, those other offices are more involved with the networking piece, and they are responsible for the BEAD program. And in fact, our claim of being the spectrum management being the largest office is no longer the case. Those offices have really bulked up. It is a lot of money. It is a big issue, and it's an issue that has been a priority for the Biden administration, this connectivity. I mean, part of it is not there obviously is economic stimulus to construct these things, but there's an idea that, hey, at the end of the day, having that connectivity enhances everyone's experience. So anyway, but it kind of gets back to, we've gone kind of through this cycle where, well, if you build out in the early 20th century, you were building out a network, it was going to be with copper or wireline. We went through a period where if you were starting over, wow, if we had to start over, we would just use wireless. We wouldn't bother with any of this copper or whatever. And now we're coming back to saying like, yeah, let's use fiber. Fiber's awesome. So not replacing wireless by any stretch, but it is interesting to see that cycle.
No, I agree. Definitely. I'm doing a lot of work in Alaska recently, and there's reaches that spectrum's the only thing you can do, whether it's new low Earth orbiting satellites or trying to get or microwave shots between towers, but you do end up having to backhaul from some type of terrestrial network at some point. So thank you for that. We do have a question in the chat. So is the Spectrum Advisory Committee governed by the FACA? When are nominations and how long are terms?
So the CSMAC, what I would call the CSMAC, it is governed by FACA. Unfortunately, the window for applications has closed. It was a formal application process pursuant to statute, and that is closed, and the applications are being considered at this time.
Okay. For my education, FACA is
Federal Advisory Committee Act. I'm guessing on the
Yep, Scott, you nailed it. That's it.
awesome. See, we all learned something.
So there are a lot of advisory. I will say just a plug real quick. So the original advisory committee, it's not so much. We have something called IRAC, which just turned 100 years old last year, but that's really more interagency. But we still try to adhere to the advisory rules, and in many ways it was the kind of the parent, if you will, of all these advisory committees. But the IRAC meets monthly, and it's a collection of all the federal agencies to deal with things that most people would find very boring.
Got it. So we had another question here. How long? The question is, how long will they ensure guard bands around critical bands like what's happening with GPS? I guess it's more about the spectrum,
Yeah.
protection and guards around, those
Yeah. So
edges.
The good question. So guard bands are one of the ways to prevent harmful interference. The idea being that when I'm let's just say, I'll be an incumbent and I have a spectrum band that I'm allowed to use, and there are rules. I want to use as much of it as I can get away with, and there are rules about how much spillover or out of band emissions is referred to. And so to kind of allow both the adjacent party and the incumbent party to use as much as possible, they'll use these guard bands, which are kind of, you might call them a dead zone. And that is one way to minimize interference with each other. And I guess the question probably implicitly recognizes, like, well, how can you keep affording to do this? If there's so much demand for spectrum, are you going to keep allowing these dead zones to take place? And one way you might get rid of them is through these making more robust receivers. That's one way to try to. But of course, I mean, that can take a long time. Even like, if you remember the DTV transition, changing from analog to digital receivers, that was a substantial effort and took a long time. It can take a long time to do things like that. But that's part of the spectrum strategy of trying to put these longer term, I won't call them problems, but longer term matters, things that take a long time, try to go ahead and formalize that and get people thinking about it now.
Yeah, that really makes sense, and I think that's part of that. The comments you made about folks taking things for granted. Like you mentioned, NOAA and our satellite communications and those guard bands are very, very critical. And I do understand people see that as like, it's just dead space. Why can't I sneak into that adjacent space there, that adjacent spectrum, and it can bleed over. And when you're talking about life and property type of data imagery that you need, you can't encroach you can't encroach on that. So
Yeah.
I do I really appreciate that part of it, because we have generations now that have grown up with mobility, wireless mobility. It's at their fingertips. Dating myself, I pre-dial up to DSLs and all that. And then when wireless networking came out, it's like, oh wow, this is just amazing, from a LAN networking perspective. But so it's great to hear about all the work that happens in there to protect that. And then the innovation side, where can you go? The higher the frequencies, the less distances. Definitely things to
Yep.
consider there.
Yep.
I'm curious, in your career, have you seen or can highlight specific technologies that actually freed up spectrum or changed and opened that up to commercial marketplaces, or has always just been squeezing and contention?
Well, there's a piece of spectrum, and it is a model for a lot of where we're going. It's called CBRS, or Citizens Broadband Radio Service. And it's one where they took a band that's largely used by the Navy for radars. And so radar use, depending on what the purpose, but it's can be very localized, and it can be episodic. Maybe you're not using the radar all the time, or maybe you're using the radar on ships, and most of the time perhaps that ship isn't really near the coast where it might cause interference. So they had a whole ban for that. And a lot of people had worked very hard to create a structure that would preserve what would be the incumbent use, preserve those radars to let them do their job. But when they weren't doing it, whether it was a matter of time or a matter of geography, that other folks can come in and use that spectrum. And that is happening at CBRS, and I think it's been very successful. It's been very iterative, which is a good thing. And but this model is probably a real kernel of this dynamic spectrum sharing. It's the idea that trying to find those times when other people can use that spectrum, and to find those times and places, how do we do that? What's the best way to figure that out? So yeah, it's happening. It's not just squeezing. Although those, like I said, there's the low hanging fruit of moving, that upgrade. Just a silly routine example is that DoD frequently has to upgrade a system, and when it upgrades a system, maybe it can operate on a smaller amount of spectrum, or maybe it operates on a different spectrum. But in advance that it has to upgrade, that because your old system is going to wear out after whatever 30, 35 years. So that's kind of the idea.
So I see a play for AI here to understand and manage those time slots, and then provide the end user, hey, you got the next 30 minutes, hour, 10 minutes,
Yeah.
whatever. And so very good.
Now I see for almost at time. I just see a question pop up in the chat that it disappeared before I could read it. So I don't know if somebody caught
I
it.
will. I'll grab that for you. Yep. So this is from Stephen Mathern, part of our leadership group here. Can you comment on whether or not NTIA or DoD plans to pilot a dynamic spectrum sharing prototype in 2024, 2025? If so, do you anticipate that as a CONUS or OCONUS prototype?
So so there are a lot of threads on the dynamic spectrum sharing, and in DoD has a strong interest in making sure that it works. I mean, you probably can figure out pretty quickly, DoD's use of spectrum, that needs to be reliable to them, and it needs to be secure. You can't have a system where somebody can hack it and figure out how to, whatever, either disable or just make it unusable, whatever. So DoD has a number of efforts. It's early, but it's an emphasis, and you'll see it. And there are meetings right now, public meetings are going to be occurring on this issue. So I would just say stay tuned. Yeah, work is on, and maybe there's some silver bullets out there, and maybe it gets done sooner than later.
Awesome, very good. Well, we are pretty close to the top of the hour, so we will wrap it up here. Scott, thank you so much for coming out and sharing with us. I love learning, especially when it comes from one of our other bureaus within the Department of Commerce, trying to keep things going and leading the way. So again, thank you. And on behalf of the of ACT-IAC and the Network and Telecommunications Community of Interest, we'd like to thank everybody who joined, and please provide feedback, join our NNT. We would love to hear about what you want to hear about. So if there's topics, and Scott, your honorary members, if you want to propose topics to hear or things that we should highlight, let us know. All right, folks. Well, thank you. Have a great weekend. Be safe, and we'll see you around. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.